Ginjo Kugo is the main antagonist of one of the most underrated segments of the Bleach story, the Fullbring arc. Personally, Ginjo is one of my favourite villains to feature within Bleach, because I love it when authors write characters that you can sympathise with and you can understand why they do what they do. Now this definitely appears to be the case with Ginjo, because by the end of the Fullbring arc you understand Ginjo as well as the reasoning behind his actions. But after he is defeated, not only do we feel sympathetic towards him, but so does Ichigo, to the extent that he had asked for Ginjo's body to be returned to the world of the living so that he could be properly buried. So let's break down and analyze the manipulative yet charming former Substitute Shingami Ginjo Kugo. Before the video begins, only 20% of the people who actually watch my content are subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy these videos, then subscribe and stick around for more content just like this. Now let's get back to the topic of the video. Ginjo makes his debut appearance in chapter 424 of the manga and in episode 343 of the anime. You will immediately notice his striking brown eyes, his tall stature, and his distinctive backcombed shoulder-length hair. In addition to this, Ginjo also wears a very noticeable necklace with a X-shaped charm that is attached to it. In general, Ginjo is a calm and well-collected individual, but this does not change the fact that he is very manipulative. One of the first instances of his manipulation occur within chapter 431, when he arrives at Ichigo's workplace and asks his boss Ikumi to do a background check on Ichigo's father, and he had intentionally done this in front of Ichigo in order to get his attention. Aside from this, he did charm his way into recruiting several individuals into his organization called Execution, and you can tell that he has a great deal of care for these people, even willing to sacrifice himself in order to save them. Now for most of the Fullbring arc, Ginjo falsely portrays himself to be a good guy, but when he is not under the influence of Tsukishima's abilities, he is evil and he takes pleasure in seeing the emotional and physical pain of others. For example, after he steals Ichigo's abilities, he takes a great deal of delight and pleasure in seeing him in this emotional state, where Ichigo is practically begging for him to return his powers back to him. It is towards the end of the Fullbring arc where we get to learn more about Ginjo's true personality. We find out that he is very arrogant, bitter, and boastful. During his battle against Ichigo and Uryu, he underestimates them and states that he can easily beat them. In addition to this, we learn that he isn't as loyal or kind to his subordinates as we were first led to believe, as in chapter 463, when Tsukishima asks Ginjo if he is planning on giving his loyal subordinate Mo Shishigawara any of Ichigo's powers that he had stolen, but Ginjo responds by saying that he is going to kill Mo as his powers could one day cause them trouble if he were to get stronger, meaning that if one of his loyal subordinates has the potential to become stronger than him, then he considers this a threat, and he isn't afraid of killing them. Despite how evil he portrays himself to be, he was still willing to let Ichigo live even after stealing his Fullbring powers, and he went on to admit in chapter 475 that he didn't want to have to kill Ichigo after failing to bring him onto his side, when he explains to him the real purpose behind the Substitute Shingami badge and how he feels betrayed by the Soul Society and Ukitake. Let's now go into detail about everything that we know about Ginjo Kugo's backstory. Now, similarly to all of the other Fullbringers, Ginjo was a spiritually aware human being. He had the latent abilities of a Fullbringer. They had of course developed sometime after one of his parents were attacked by a hollow. This hollow had obviously left remnants of its power dwelling within Ginjo's mother, and he had inherited the remnants of this power after his birth. Eventually, Ginjo would come to be known as the first Substitute Shingami, and he had of course been given his very own Substitute Shingami badge by none other than Captain Ukitake, similarly to how Ichigo was given a Substitute Shingami badge by Ukitake at the end of the Soul Society arc. In chapter 477, towards the end of the Fullbring arc, we learned that while Ginjo was a Substitute Shinigami, he had found a young Tsukishima. He had realized that like himself, this young Tsukishima was also alone, and in order to cheer him up, he had told him that starting from today, he is going to accompany him. We learned that Tsukishima had been taken under Ginjo's wing. He was taught by him how to utilize his own powers and how to fight. Sometime after this point, Ginjo would become disheartened by the Soul Society, after he had learned that the Substitute Shingami badge that he was given was in fact a surveillance device. The Soul Society had used this in order to keep an eye on Ginjo, as well as limiting the full extent of his powers. It would make sense that after learning this, Ginjo would feel betrayed. In chapter 479, we learn about the extent of Ginjo's reaction to this revelation. He had become a criminal who had robbed the powers of Shinigami, and he had gone on a Shinigami killing spree. Not too long after this, he had gone off of the Soul Society's radar and had disappeared without a trace, and eventually he had begun to rally and recruit other fulllbringers who had felt like they were oppressed and treated like sub-citizens because of their abilities. He had banded these fulllbringers together in order to form his own secret organization called Execution. I guess this was his version of the X-Men. In chapter 473 we learned that the other fulllbringers had made a deal with Ginjo in order to share their powers with one another in order to pledge themselves to him. And we now bring ourselves to the present timeline of the story, which is 17 months after the defeat of Aizen. It is at this point that Ginjo had started to target Ichigo in a plan to steal his latent Shinigami abilities. He had devised this plan with the other members of Execution. He himself would fall under the influence of Tsukishima's abilities in order to portray Tsukishima as the sole villain, when in actual fact he was working alongside him. And this was all a part of their plan in order to steal Ichigo's abilities in order to strengthen their own. So in chapter 424 we get our first impression of Ginjo Kugo, as we see that he is running after somebody who has stolen his bag. Ichigo proves that despite having lost his Shinigami powers, his physical body appears to have retained the reflexes that he had honed during battle, and so he was able to apprehend the thief who had stolen Ginjo's bag. After returning his bag to him, Ginjo asks Ichigo whether if he wants to go out for a bowl of ramen. When Ichigo refuses and walks away, we see an object dangling from Ginjo's bag, as it appears to be the very familiar Substitute Shingami badge. Ginjo then says to himself that Ichigo is more cautious than he had first thought, and he appears to have a very sinister expression on his face, foreshadowing his true intentions. After some time, Ginjo turns up again at Ichigo's workplace. He invites himself in and has a bowl of ramen in front of them, much to Ichigo's annoyance. Obviously at this point you can tell that Ginjo has an obsession with ramen. It appears to be his favorite food. Ginjo reveals his intentions for coming to Ichigo's workplace, as he was looking for a odd job store that would take on a job for him. Ginjo very abruptly places a photo of Ichigo's father onto the table. Ichigo is immediately agitated by this and questions whether if Ginjo is mocking him. He tells him that if he wants to know anything about his father, then he can just ask him directly. It is at this point that Ginjo begins to instill doubt into Ichigo, as he questions him if he knows really everything that there is to know about his father. He further elaborates that there are things that Ichigo doesn't know about his own family. At this point he was already struggling with his powerlessness, and the fact that his friends and family were trying to keep him out of any issues with hollows or supernatural beings. They didn't want to drag a powerless Ichigo into harm's way, so in their own way they had tried to protect him, and Ginjo is aware of this, hence why he manipulates Ichigo through his family. He tells him to also go to Urahara's shop, to which he sees his younger sister leaving, and Ginjo tells Ichigo that she has been visiting Urahara's store very regularly, and that there are things that Ichigo doesn't know about Urahara. He questions Ichigo how much does he really know about him. He warns him that he should strike while he can in order to protect his family. At this moment, Ginjo is unnecessarily filling Ichigo's mind with doubt. When the reasons for Karen visiting Urahara's store are made obvious, she states that it is now their turn to protect their older brother, because Ichigo has been protecting them and fighting for their sake his entire life, and now that he is powerless, they want to return the favor. Urahara understands Karin's plight, and it is for this reason that he reassures her that if anything happens to come back to him, and that they can make the necessary precautions. So it definitely makes you question Ginjo's intentions here when he tries to turn Ichigo against his own friends and family. After Ginjo reveals his name to him, Ichigo states that he doesn't trust him just yet. It is at this moment that he hands over to Ichigo a business card. It appears to be an invitation to a group called Execution. So chronologically, after handing over to Ichigo the business card, it is at this time that Ginjo actually cuts down Uryu, and we know that throughout the duration of the Fullbring arc, it is presumed that Tsukishima had been carrying out these attacks. But this very first attack that had severely injured the Quincy was done by Ginjo himself. In chapter 459, it is revealed that Ginjo had instructed Tsukishima to cut him with his Fullbring abilities, so that he could grow closer to Ichigo and gain his trust. Tsukishima complies with Ginjo's orders by altering his memories, so that he actually perceives Tsukishima as an enemy who had betrayed him. This is because Ginjo's ability to act is terrible, so by using Tsukishima's abilities, it will conceal Ginjo's true motives and add some credibility to his false narrative. As we already know, it isn't long before Ichigo is forced to call Execution, and he arranges to meet up with them in person. When Ichigo arrives, he tells Ginjo that one of their friends was attacked, and he wants to help. It is at this moment that Ginjo questions whether if Ichigo trusts him. Ichigo states that he is aware that Ginjo is no ordinary human, and at the same time Ginjo is aware that Ichigo has nobody else to turn to at this moment. He does however reveal that he had brought that photo of Isshin to his workplace in order to get Ichigo's attention. Ginjo reveals his false intentions when he brings Ichigo into their hideout and introduces him to the other Fullbringers. He lies to Ichigo by telling him that they want to restore his Shinigami powers. Ginjo then proceeds to explain the nature of Fullbring Fullbringers to Ichigo, and it is also revealed that Chad is a part of their group. Now this fact angers Ichigo as he demands to know what on earth is going on. He reveals to him that they are Fullbringers, and their powers are closely resemble to hollows than Shinigami. He gains Ichigo's trust by spinning this fake narrative that the Fullbringers consider their powers to be a nuisance. They are aware that Ichigo could relate to this fact because he possessed hollow powers himself, and we are well aware of how much Ichigo was troubled by its inner hollow during the Arrancar arc. Ginjo elaborates that the Fullbringers desire to get rid of their unpleasant powers. They aim to do so by transferring their powers to an individual who is a human and a Shinigami. They actively want Ichigo to regain his Shinigami powers so that they can give their Fullbring powers to him. Ginjo further reassures Ichigo that once his powers are returned, they will be further topped up by the Fullbringers sharing their powers with him. In chapter 433, the outcome of this conversation is that Ichigo agrees to assist them, and he begins his training with Ruruka, who places him inside of his dollhouse. Eventually, Ichigo does awaken his own Fullbring powers, and in chapter 437, Ginjo explains that with every battle that Ichigo has undergone, it was carved into his soul, and at the same time, his Substitute Shingami badge had memories of these battles also. This attachment that he has with this special object means that even if Ichigo lost his powers, the Substitute Shingami badge would always remember what it feels like to have those powers, and the connection that he has made with his Substitute Shingami badge is going to be crucial for him to jumpstart his latent abilities once again. But I'll come back to this, as it's something very important that Ginjo explains to Ichigo after he has completed his Fullbring training. In chapter 441, Ginjo relays a falsified account of who Tsukishima is to Ichigo, describing him as their former leader. He tells Ichigo that Tsukishima had formed a group execution in order to eliminate the powers of the Fullbringers, and he had devised a plan to achieve this. He had wanted to do so by handing over the powers to another Substitute Shinigami, but apparently after the Substitute Shinigami had received some of the powers of the Fullbringers, Tsukishima had changed his mind, and he ended up killing the Shinigami, as well as killing the Fullbringers who had given their powers to him, and it was at this point that apparently Tsukishima had disappeared. Ginjo solidifies his story by showing to Ichigo the Substitute Shinigami badge that had supposedly belonged to this Shinigami, when in actual fact we are aware that this badge belongs to Ginjo. At this moment, Tsukishima is everybody's enemy. Even at this point, Ginjo is also under this impression, thanks to his memories being altered by Tsukishima's Book of Endability. Ginjo tells Ichigo that by Tsukishima attacking Uryu and making contact with Orihime, he is definitely trying to draw Ichigo's attention, and it is for this reason that they're going to speed up Ichigo's training. But for now, he needs to go home and rest in order to be ready for the next training session. In chapter 443, when Ichigo begins his next training session with Jackie Tristan, Chad approaches Ginjo and questions whether if he knows Tsukishima's ability. He asks Ginjo whether if Tsukishima has the ability to plant a thought into somebody's mind or to impair their memory. He directly asks Ginjo whether if this is Tsukishima's Fullbring, telling him not to hide anything from him. This is a very fascinating conversation because it's the first time that Ginjo has been questioned directly regarding Tsukishima and whether if he is hiding anything. Ginjo states that he isn't hiding anything at all, it's just that he isn't sure. If Tsukishima did indeed have an ability like this, Ginjo swears that he would have told them from the very beginning. He does tell Chad that he is aware that Tsukishima's Fullbring is called Book of the End. It is a sword that is capable of cutting anything, but as far as he knows, it doesn't have any other special abilities. In this encounter, Chad is very confrontational, as when Ginjo states that it isn't possible for a Fullbring to change with growth, to which Chad states that his own Fullbring powers have gone through a lot of changes, but Ginjo explains that this is because Chad hadn't actualized the full potential of his Fullbring. He was still in its very early stages. He tells Chad that they have lived with their Fullbrings for many years. They are past the stage of developing their Fullbrings that Chad is currently experiencing. While Chad asks about the state of Orihime's memories, Ginjo brings up another point, as he reminds Chad that Uryu had also apparently been cut down by Tsukishima. So logically, if Orihime was also attacked by Tsukishima, then Uryu's memories must also be in disarray. Ginjo tells Chad that if Uryu's memories have also been affected, then it means that they have something to worry about. But if Uryu is okay, then they can deduce that somebody other than Tsukishima had just stabbed Orihime. It is at this moment that Tsukishima cuts down the door and he interrupts that conversation. All of the Fullbringers, including Ginjo, consider Tsukishima to be their enemy here. Tsukishima immediately cuts the fish tank where Ichigo and Jackie are training, but suddenly Ichigo emerges from it in a new form. It is at this point Ichigo begins his battle with Tsukishima, as Ginjo holds back Chad from assisting. Ginjo argues that now that Ichigo has activated his Fullbring, it's about time that they tell him about Tsukishima, but Chad, being one of his closest friends, states that they don't know how powerful Ichigo's Fullbring is yet, and on top of this, they don't even know if Ichigo can control these powers. So telling him that Tsukishima had attacked Orihime will only make things worse for Ichigo, and it may serve as a distraction for him and limit his performance. It is at this moment that Ichigo appears and he thanks the two of them for being so concerned about him, as he understands that it was Tsukishima who had attacked Orihime and Uryu. When Tsukishima is about to deliver the final attack to Ichigo, Ginjo appears before him and protects him. When I was first reading the Fullbring arc, it was at this moment that a lot of the doubts that I had about Ginjo were cleared. Seeing him protect Ichigo from Tsukishima was really reassuring for me. Prior to this, I was always questioning his motives, but just moments ago he had explained to Chad everything that he knows about Tsukishima, and now he demonstrates his loyalty by protecting Ichigo. Now in hindsight, after having read the entirety of the Fullbring arc, we can see every moment where Ginjo had lied to the others, and every instance where his false memories were leading him to believe that Tsukishima was the enemy. Ginjo and Tsukishima continue their battle in chapter 446, and when Ichigo helps, Yukio traps him within one of his pocket dimensions in order to contain him. In chapter 447, we see that the members of Execution have ended up using their backup headquarters. When Ichigo is freed from Yukio's pocket dimension, Ginjo explains to him that Tsukishima was able to escape, but despite this, they are concerned about his true objectives. He had appeared not because he had wanted to harm the members of Execution, but rather he was after Ichigo, and so begins the final part of Ichigo's training, as Yukio takes them into one of his pocket dimensions. Orihime is also brought here in order to heal Ichigo. During this final part of Ichigo's training, Ginjo is very aggressive and assertive, as he becomes impatient with Ichigo, to the point where Orihime has to intervene and put up a shield in order to protect Ichigo. Ichigo appears to be responding well to the pressure that Ginjo is putting on him, and he wants to continue fighting, despite him being badly wounded by Ginjo. In chapter 450, Ginjo notes that Ichigo appears to have become stronger ever since Orihime was brought into the dimension. It appears that he is stronger when people that he wants to protect are near him. At this late stage in their training, Ginjo blinds Ichigo by cutting through his eyes, and he prevents Orihime from healing him, ordering her to stand back and watch. Ginjo states that when Ichigo had lost his powers, he had also lost his resolve to fight, and it is for this reason that he is behaving so harshly with him. He wants to drag him back to battle. In this instance, Ginjo plays the villain, as he impales Ichigo with his sword, and then threatens to kill both Chad and Orihime. Ichigo is of course angered by Ginjo's words, and at this point Ichigo's Fullbring begins to completely change. After Ginjo had pushed Ichigo to the brink of despair, it had resulted in Ichigo's Fullbring being complete. This means that his training is finally over, as Ginjo states that he is proud of him. He wanted to be present when Ichigo's Fullbring was complete, because the burst of energy that is released from the object of the Fullbring can ruin the user's body. He then apologizes to Ichigo for momentarily playing the part of a villain, and now that Ichigo has completed his Fullbring training, he formally welcomes him into Execution. In chapter 452, Ginjo asks Ichigo whether if he was able to see something after his Fullbring was completed. Ichigo states that despite being blinded, he was able to see Ginjo bathed in Reiatsu. It is at this moment that Ginjo explains that he had cut Ichigo's eyes in order to prove to him that he is regaining his Shinigami powers. He tells him that when Ichigo had lost his Shinigami powers, a tiny part of this Reiatsu had accumulated in a single part of himself, and it is this tiny portion of Reiatsu that they had needed to jumpstart, and they had done so through the connection that Ichigo has with his Substitute Shingami badge. The badge literally acted as a defibrillator, as it was able to jolt this small part of Reiatsu awake. Ginjo explains that in time his Fullbring and Shinigami powers will fuse. In chapter 453, after all of Ichigo's friends have been turned against him by Tsukishima, Ginjo arrives to tell Ichigo that Tsukishima has gotten to all of the other members of Execution. Ginjo reveals Tsukishima's ability to Ichigo, as he states that Tsukishima doesn't disrupt somebody's memory, but instead he manipulates their past. Tsukishima is able to place himself into the past of those that he cuts, thus explaining why all of Ichigo's friends and family have believed that Tsukishima has always been there for them as a family member or a friend. Ginjo tells Ichigo that all of his friends and family at the moment think that they are the crazy ones, because it is they who do not know who Tsukishima is, when all of them have these false memories of him. Yukio interrupts that conversation and brings them to Tsukishima's mansion. When they finally see Tsukishima, Ichigo charges him, but Ginjo holds him back, as he reminds him that they cannot afford to get cut by Tsukishima even once. When Tsukishima continues to manipulate Ichigo via his friends and family, Ginjo is powerless to watch on as Ichigo struggles. Ginjo then breaks the stairs to Tsukishima's mansion, thus preventing any of Ichigo's friends and family from following them. He tells Ichigo to activate his Fullbring and to fight Tsukishima with all that he's got. While Ichigo fights Tsukishima, Ginjo faces off against the other members of Execution and Tsukishima's assistant Mo Shishigawara. In chapter 457, when Ichigo is about to be cut by Tsukishima, Ginjo appears in time and intercepts the attack. Now it is important to note that at this moment, Tsukishima's Book of the End ability stopped having an effect on Ginjo. He had remembered the true purpose of his plan, which was to steal Ichigo's powers, and Tsukishima incidentally was no longer considered to be an enemy by him. And you'll also note a small detail that Ginjo stops referring to Ichigo by his first name and instead refers to him by his family name Kurosaki the moment that he is cut by Tsukishima. At this moment, he blatantly lies to Ichigo as he tells him that he still considers Tsukishima to be his enemy and that he thinks of Ichigo as his friend. Of course, Ichigo is relieved to hear this. The minute that Ginjo and Ichigo are about to team up to face off against Tsukishima, Uryu arrives. He points his Quincy bow and arrow towards Ginjo as he reveals that the individual who had cut him down was indeed Ginjo and not Tsukishima. Tsukishima proceeds to take out Uryu while Ginjo reveals his true intentions by cutting down Ichigo. He states that he had allowed Tsukishima to cut him twice in order to return him back to who he was. Ginjo reveals his true intentions, which were to steal Ichigo's Fullbring, as he impales him through the chest with his sword and steals his powers. After Ichigo's powers are taken from him, Tsukishima and Ginjo walk away, but they are surprised to see a burst of energy behind them. Upon turning around, Ginjo sees Ichigo in his Shinigami attire. Shocked at what he is seeing, he exclaims that it's impossible for Ichigo to have his powers restored, but as we know, the group of Shinigami from the Soul Society who arrive explain to Ginjo that they had all shed their Ryatsu in order to restore Ichigo's powers. In chapter 460 begins Ichigo's fight against Ginjo. During this encounter, we have several revelations, like how Hitsugaya states that Ginjo was the first Substitute Shinigami, and how the position of the Substitute Shinigami was originally created for Ginjo. The Fullbringer Yukio then places Uryu, Ichigo, and Ginjo into a pocket dimension. During their battle here, it is revealed that Ginjo also is able to use the Getsuga Tensho, as Uryu deduces that after Ginjo had stolen Ichigo's Fullbring and his Ryatsu, he was probably able to use Ichigo's abilities too. In chapter 473, Ginjo questions the motive for Ichigo fighting, as he states that with Tsukishima dying, all of his friends and family who have been affected by his abilities will return to normal. So indeed, what is compelling Ichigo to continue to fight? When he gets no response, he tells Ichigo that there is a common enemy that they both should be fighting against. In chapter 474, he reveals to Ichigo the true purpose of the Substitute Shinigami badge, which we stated at the start of the video is a surveillance device, which also plays a role in restricting the Substitute Shinigami's power. And yes, Ginjo reveals that this was all a plan that was devised by Ukitake in order to control a Substitute Shinigami. Everybody in the Soul Society had known about this. Ginjo states that they were both lied to by the nicest Shinigami within the Soul Society, but Ichigo interrupts Ginjo's speech by activating his Bankai. He does state that he was suspicious of what Ukitake had told him when he had handed him the Substitute Shinigami badge, but the fact remains that he trusts him, and he's grateful for the power to protect people. It is at this moment that Ginjo decides that he cannot reason with Ichigo, and that he didn't want to kill him, but he has no choice but to activate his Bankai and to take him out. After activating his Bankai, Ginjo reminds Ichigo that he also has hollow powers, thus making both Ginjo and Ichigo even more similar than just being two Substitute Shinigamis. They're both Shinigamis who possess the powers of a hollow. In chapter 476, Ginjo has an inner monologue during this fight. He proclaims to himself that he will crush the Shinigami who had betrayed him. He had assumed that Ichigo would act righteously and to tell him that what he is doing is wrong, but Ichigo didn't even do that. Ginjo can see through Ichigo's eyes that he is trying to understand him. Through his eyes, he is able to see that Ichigo is standing shoulder to shoulder. He is in the same place as Ginjo. While trying to understand him, at the same time he is denouncing everything that he is. He then fires a blast towards Ichigo, who is able to block it. It is then that he is able to cut Ginjo from his shoulder all the way down to his torso. After clashing one more time, Ginjo's sword breaks. He falls to his knees and begins to succumb to his injuries. In his final moments, he looks up to see a very sympathetic Ichigo, who appears to be genuinely feeling sorry for him. He thinks to himself that if their roles were reversed, and if Ichigo was the first Substitute Shinigami, would he have ended up like him? In chapter 478, we learn that Ginjo has died from Tsukishima, and his body is brought to the Soul Society by Renji. However, in chapter 479, Ichigo arrives at the Soul Society and requests for the head captain to allow him to bring Ginjo's body back to the human world so that he can properly bury him. Now, much to my surprise, Ginjo makes a return during the 1000-Year Blood War arc, albeit for a minor role. He appears to have been sent to the Soul Society along with Tsukishima and Giriko. They were found within Rukongai by none other than Kukakushiba and brought to her residence. It is here that they had begun their training with Ganju in order to prepare for the upcoming battle against the Quincy. Now, this was one of the points that I was hoping for Kubo to expand upon within the manga, as I remember feeling so genuinely excited seeing the Fullbringers fight on the side of Ichigo. I kept theorizing in my head several moments where Ginjo would have apologized to Ichigo and would have fought alongside with him against the Quincy, but sadly I was ultimately disappointed as none of what I had imagined had turned out to be. In chapter 681, we see Ginjo and Tsukishima arrive at the Soul King's palace, and they repay their debt to Ichigo by Tsukishima aiding Ichigo by utilizing his abilities to alter the past of his Zanbakuto to a time before he had fought Yhwach. When Ichigo questions what Tsukishima is doing, Tsukishima states that it was Ginjo's idea to go onto Ichigo's side. Ginjo corrects him by stating that they were simply repaying their debt to him. Now sadly, this is the last time that we see Ginjo within the manga, but I do know that his story is expanded upon within the Can't For Your Own World light novels, as we learn a lot more about his character as he plays more of a significant role within those novels. But again, that's something that I want to cover on my channel down the line. Now there are a few pressing questions that I have regarding Ginjo's character that weren't answered within the manga. I want to know why he has formed a grudge against Isshin and Urahara. Did these characters interact in the past? And speaking about the past, I would love to know more about his backstory. I do honestly think that Tsukishima and Ginjo were planned to have more of a major role within the 1000-Year Blood War arc, but with how Kubo's health issues had caught up to him by the end of the arc, he had no choice but to rush the finale. I think if these circumstances were different, then we would have seen more of Ginjo, and I'm counting on Kubo correcting this for the anime adaptation. After all, Ginjo, Tsukishima and Giriko were training with Ganju. We see this in chapter 518, but we don't get to see the Fullbringers until chapter 681, like Kubo had completely forgotten about them, all the way until Ichigo had needed Tsukishima's help right at the end. Regarding Ginjo's character, that is a point that really disappoints me, and again, like I said, I want to see more of him in the 1000-Year Blood War arc. So here's hoping that the anime gives us more of Ginjo, but we're at the point in the video where I want to hand over the discussion to all of you. What do you think about the character of Ginjo Kugo? Do you think he was too much of a cliched villain, and consequently you saw his betrayal coming? Or were you genuinely surprised by Ginjo being a villain during the Fullbring arc? And what did you think about his involvement within the 1000-Year Blood War arc? Did you want him to have more of a significant role within the story? Or are you pleased with how things turned out? I really want to know about your thoughts on this character because the discussion around Ginjo can get very controversial. To wrap up, I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for making it to the end. And if you have any other suggestions for Bleach characters that you want me to analyze, then definitely leave your suggestions in the comments, and I can't wait to see you in my next Bleach character analysis video. If you enjoy my content, then you can support my channel through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or even through YouTube by becoming a channel member. You will gain access to exclusive channel perks and a Discord server which I frequently use. So become a member of my Zero Division and be the first to know about my upcoming videos. And once again, thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.